The whole tech side of the internet is going crazy over the leaks and rumors for next year's MacBook lineup, since the current lineup makes absolutely zero sense with a killer value MacBook Air for $1,000, then a terrible value $1,300 MacBook Pro, which many people agree shouldn't even exist, and then a massive $700 price gap going up to the new 14-inch MacBook Pro for $2,000. But to make things even worse, Mark Gurman just came out with an extremely controversial report claiming that Apple is not only adding another new M2 MacBook Air to the lineup, but they're upgrading the entry-level MacBook Pro again with the same exact M2 chip, basically making it seem like the most confusing report ever, with many people flat out saying that Mark is wrong. But don't worry, I've been giving this a lot of thought, and I think that I've finally figured it all out. So let's get right into it. First off, Mark Gurman's report says that 5 brand new Macs are coming in 2022, including a high-end iMac, an updated Mac Mini, and a new Mac Pro with Apple Silicon, all of which we've already made full deep dive videos on, so definitely check them out if you haven't already. But in this video, we've got to discuss the 2022 MacBook lineup because everything else seems to make sense compared to the MacBook side, which seems like it's about to get more extensive and confusing than ever before. Mark Gurman says that there's going to be a new version of the entry-level MacBook Pro, which is something that many people weren't expecting because the current entry-level M1 model doesn't really have a place in the lineup. And I agree, it doesn't. It's $300 more expensive than the MacBook Air, and it's not really much faster at all. In fact, there are only a few benefits, like a touch bar, which nobody likes anyway, a slightly brighter 500 nit display, slightly better microphones, a faster 61-watt power adapter, and cooling fans, which don't really improve performance that much. So for the past few months, especially after the new M1 MacBook Pros were released, we've been literally telling people to just buy the M1 MacBook Air instead of the M1 MacBook Pro, since you can get it on sale right now on Amazon for $900 and get it shipped before Christmas using the link below. And then if you really want a MacBook Pro, we've been telling you guys just to go straight for the 14-inch for $2,000, completely skipping out on the M1 MacBook Pro altogether. So the big question is this: why is Mark Gurman saying that there's going to be a refreshed MacBook Pro, and how is it going to fit into the 2022 MacBook lineup, especially alongside the brand new redesigned M2 MacBook Air, which everyone is so excited about? So let's go ahead and try to break it all down, and thankfully, Mark Gurman has some older reports that help piece this puzzle together. A few months back, Mark told us that the entry-level MacBook Pro is actually going to be getting the same new M2 chip that's going to be going into the MacBook Air, which makes total sense. And then on top of that, Mark Gurman said that the new Air will be sold alongside the current M1 MacBook Air. So that means that it will not be replacing it. So it's simply going to be a new, more expensive M2 MacBook Air model, while the M1 model will likely stick around at the same $999 price point for another year. And this actually makes a whole lot of sense for Apple to do, because it's exactly what they did in 2018 when they revealed the new redesigned MacBook Air for $1,199 and still kept the old thick silver bezel model around for a full year at a $999 price point. And then in 2019, Apple dropped the base price of the newly designed 2019 MacBook Air by $100, so it started at $1,099 while fully discontinuing the old $999 model. And then finally, in early 2020, they released a new Intel-based MacBook Air at that same $999 price point from before. So over the course of a couple of years, Apple essentially phased out the old $1,000 MacBook Air and brought the newly designed model down to that same $1,000 price point. And I think that's exactly what Apple is going to be doing with the new M2 MacBook Air, releasing it at a higher price at first, while keeping the same old M1 MacBook Air at $999. So the big question is this: how is Apple gonna price both the new M2 MacBook Air and the Pro to make them make sense in terms of a decent MacBook lineup? Because it's currently a bit confusing with the M1 Pro not really being worth it. So what is Apple gonna change this time around to actually make the M2 MacBook Pro worth the extra cash over the M2 Air? Because in my opinion, the Pro absolutely has to cost more than the Air, contrary to the belief of some people who think Apple will be releasing a more expensive 15-inch MacBook Air, which is based on some old rumors. And Mark Gurman has already said that Apple was thinking of creating a 15-inch Air, but they completely scrapped that idea, and they're not gonna do it anymore. And if you think about it, a new MacBook Pro has always been more expensive than a MacBook Air. It just makes sense from a naming point of view. So the main thing we've got to answer is how much the new M2 MacBook Pro is gonna cost, and why would somebody pay the extra cash for it over the Air? Because recent reports are already showing the new Air to be a killer upgrade, with a full redesign that looks absolutely beautiful, and Ming-Chi Kuo fully believes that it's getting a new mini LED display, which is actually pretty surprising, putting even more pressure on the M2 MacBook Pro. Well, for starters, Apple could add in the same benefits that the current M1 MacBook Pro has over the M1 Air, like battery life, cooling fans to stop thermal throttling, a slightly brighter display, slightly better speakers and microphones, and a faster charging adapter. But in reality, those differences alone aren't enough, because the current M1 Pro is not worth it compared to the Air, so the new lineup obviously needs more differences for it to make sense. So let's get into the changes that I personally think are enough to make the future M2 MacBook Pro worth it over the Air. First off, I fully believe that the new model is going to be getting a full redesign, just like the M2 MacBook Air, because if it sticks to the current design, absolutely nobody would buy it over the new Air. It simply makes no sense. So with that said, I think it totally makes sense for the new M2 MacBook Pro to get the exact same display and design as the 14-inch M1 Pro MacBook Pro. The only difference would be the lack of maybe some of the ports, like for example, maybe one less Thunderbolt port, or maybe the removal of the HDMI port or something like that. Yes, that would obviously suck, but it would push people to spend more cash on the $2,000 M1 Pro MacBook Pro, which Apple loves to do. On top of that, I think this new entry-level M2 MacBook Pro would stick with that beautiful 14-inch display with 120Hz ProMotion technology, while the new M2 Air would likely only have a 13-inch display without the super thin bezels and without 120Hz ProMotion. So that display difference alone might be enough to make people spend the extra cash on the M2 MacBook Pro. And then finally, we've got to talk about that new M2 chip and the differences we'll see between the Air and the Pro MacBooks. Mark Gurman has already said that the M2 chip will essentially be the replacement to the M1, with the same 8-core CPU with 4 high-performance cores and 4 efficiency cores, but it's gonna have a faster GPU with either 9 or 10 GPU cores instead of the M1 that goes up to 8, with only 7 on the base model M1 MacBook Air. So I think Apple is gonna do exactly that. They're gonna give the M2 MacBook Air a 9-core GPU at the base model, while giving the M2 MacBook Pro the full 10 GPU cores. And if you didn't already know, the current fanless MacBook Air actually does throttle the performance of the M1 chip a little bit. So with the M2 chip having more GPU cores, the MacBook Pro might actually have a noticeable jump in performance next year. And then on top of that, if the M2 MacBook Air gets off-white bezels, like all of the rumors are pointing to, then some people would gladly pay the extra cash just to get the black bezels that they prefer. So with all that said, there are actually going to be some very good reasons to go for the new MacBook Pro over the Air, with the biggest one being the 14-inch display with ProMotion. And just like that, it now finally makes sense for Apple to keep the entry-level MacBook Pro around as a stepping stone going up to the $2,000 M1 MacBook Pro, since the current $700 gap is way too large to make any sense at all. So with that said, let's get into my predictions for the pricing of Apple's entire 2022 MacBook lineup. We of course have the M1 MacBook Air, which I think is going to stick to the same exact $999 starting price because it's still a great deal, and I think that's Apple's magical number for a starting MacBook. And then I think the brand new redesigned M2 13-inch MacBook Air will be priced at either $1199 like what they did in 2018, or potentially up to $1299 if they want to raise their price points because of supply chain and inflationary issues. And then of course you've got the M2 14-inch MacBook Pro, which I think will be priced at either $1399 or $1499. And yes, I know that's $100 to $200 more expensive than the current M1 model, but if you think about it, you're gonna be able to get that awesome new design with the 14-inch mini LED display with 120Hz ProMotion at $500 to $600 less than the current $2,000 M1 Pro MacBook Pro, which I bet a lot of people would pay for. So this would essentially create a smaller gap between the lower end M2 MacBook Pro and the $2,000 14-inch MacBook Pro, just like in the past when the base model was $1,300 and the high-end model was $1,800. And yes, I fully believe that Apple is not going to be upgrading the current 14 and 16-inch M1 Pro MacBook Pro models until 2023, so those will be staying in the lineup next year. But I do want to emphasize that Apple is going to make it super tempting to just buy the $2,000 model, because I fully expect the M2 MacBook Pro to start with only 256 gigs of slower storage, not the crazy 5,000 to 7,000 megabytes per second SSDs that the M1 Pro models have. And it's only gonna have 8 gigs of slower RAM, not the insane 6200 megahertz LPDDR5X that the M1 Pro chip uses. So just by upgrading to a 512 gig SSD and 16 gigs of RAM, you'll essentially be only $100 to $200 off of the price of the high-end M1 Pro MacBook Pro, depending on what they price the M2 model at, which is exactly what Apple did in the past with their Intel Macs. So if you look at everything from this perspective, which is based on what Apple did in the past, this new 2022 MacBook lineup makes total sense. And this time around, it makes even more sense for Apple to have an entry-level MacBook Pro. So there you go, those are my thoughts on the new 2022 MacBook lineup. If you totally disagree with me, then go ahead and comment your thoughts down below. But if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and click the circle above to subscribe for more videos like this one, and check out one of those two right over there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.